at the age of 17, I took what I told my parents somewhat disingenuously was to be a gap year before university. And when you came to, and I never went. So I went to India. I hitchhiked most of the way to India. I've been fascinated with India and Indian culture and Indian religion as far as I can remember. And I particularly remember one morning, it's been January 1976, and I was standing by the side of a road somewhere. A gentleman came up to me. I imagined he was a civil servant. And he said, "Good morning. He said, what is your country?" So I said, "England." And what is your concept of Godhead? I just thought that was so wonderful. You know, someone who just you've never met before, just come up to you in the middle of the road and ask what my concept of Godhead was. You know, of course, being just 18 years old, so he didn't have a particularly sophisticated concept of ultimate reality, and seemed to me that he was more interested in telling me his concept than listening to mine anyway. So I listened to him. But, this is what I love about India, where the spiritual and the mundane exist in a kind of seamless relationship. And fast forward 30-something years, and just before leaving Thailand, I was in the house of an old lady who was to be accompanying me on this trip, was unfortunately ill. She was watching television, so cable television, and I wanted to skip forward to see whether the typhoon in Japan was going to hinder our travel plans. And so I was channel surfing, and I stopped upon this American channel, and it was a young lad of, I don't know, 17, 18, or maybe, or something, and he seemed to have been successful in some kind of a competition, talent show or something. And the interviewer said, "How do you feel?" And I said, "Wow, I don't know, I'm just having trouble processing reality right now." And I was so impressed by that. You know, I just couldn't imagine how I would translate that into Thai, or imagine any young Thai person of my acquaintance who would, in a moment of excitement, would express himself as having difficulty processing reality. So my conclusion is that with the economic progress of India, the rising of India as an economic power, I think that the spiritual side seems to be waning somewhat, but perhaps the bright side, the silver lining of the cloud of American economic decline might be teenagers who worry about processing reality. And so an interest in life. This for me is the heart of Buddhism. That Buddhism's not a teaching which wants to give you cut and dried answers and telling you you should believe this and you shouldn't believe that, but is encouraging you to ask questions about life, and not just the details of life or the worldly projects in which we get so easily engrossed and enmeshed, but in the very our very humanity and what we're doing with our lives. And it's often we're just so busy going from this to the next thing and the next thing to the next thing that we never really stop and ask ourselves, well, why, what for? And this is why it's so important to have a daily meditation period. I'm very appreciative of the invitation toward you just now. I encourage you to take the present up on that, because irrespective of any spiritual progress that you might make as you would usually conceive of it, just the very effort to make some time to stop and to be with yourself as a human being rather than yourself as a student or as a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a son or a daughter or a husband or a wife or whatever. Having a time which you put aside every day, the time just to relinquish for a moment all your conventional identities and worries and anxieties. And when you do that, I think that you'll observe that as your mind calms down even a little, then things start to bubble up. You think, yeah, this is really not a wise thing that I'm doing right now. Or I really should spend more time doing this and doing that. And those kinds of thoughts, are not to be dismissed as an obstacle to meditation per se, but they're also indications that we're having a little bit more communication with ourselves. And there's the sort of exponential growth of our capacity to communicate with others engulfs us, and there seems to be a corresponding lack of communication with ourselves. And there are so many ways now in which we can distract ourselves. And in our lives, I think the dilemma or the conflict between something which is quite obviously noble and that which is ignoble, that which is good, that which is bad, occur relatively infrequently. But what does bedevil us is the draw towards the superficial and the trivial. And so we've seen huge trivialization of our lives, I think, over the past years. And how much of what we say, what we text, what we email is really conducive to our long-lasting benefit and happiness. The Buddhist teachings are encapsulated in a very simple phrase which features in most Buddhist ceremonies. And the phrase is, for the welfare, for the happiness and for the welfare of all sentient beings for all of time. Or we could say sustainably, for the sustainable happiness and welfare of self and others. The Buddha is pointing to the need for us to give attention both to the outer and the inner, but also to be creating happiness and welfare of others, and the families, the community, in the society in which we live. The transmission of Buddhism to the West has been one in which the meditation techniques have been emphasized and quite understandably so, in that skillful means of training, educating, cultivating the mind been pretty well discarded in Western culture, or completely neglected, particularly in the Protestant cultures. So it's quite natural, and I myself and many of my fellow monks came to Buddhism through this interest in training the mind. But to consider Buddhism as a solipsistic, internal, individual project is to seriously misrepresent the Buddhist teachings. In fact, at the time of the Buddha himself, the word which was most commonly used to refer to this teaching was the Dhamma Vinaya. So the Dhamma is all those teachings focused on inner development. And the Vinaya consists of all those teachings intended to create the optimum environment for the practice of Dhamma. So many of you may have heard the word Vinaya, Vinaya, and perhaps assumed that it's a term restricted to the monastic discipline. This is not the case, but the Buddha established the monastic order specifically to provide the most conducive environment for the study, practice of the teachings and the propagation of them. But nevertheless, he, in what ways he could, given that he was living in a non-Buddhist culture, and one in which there were some shared values, but many conflicting values, he laid down precepts or suggested precepts and conventions in the world in such a way as to enhance or support practice of Dhamma as much as possible. So the Buddhist teachings, the Eightfold Path, are abbreviated or summarized, called the Threefold Training of Sila, Samadhi, Panya. And this word, the Pali word, is sikha, which can be translated as sikha, but as training, but also its a wider meaning is indicated by the fact that in Thai language, the word for education is siksa, which is directly derived from this word. So we can refer to the Buddhist training as essentially a system of education, an education of conduct, an education of the heart, an education of our understanding of life. And this is not a step-by-step education or training, but it is an organic or holistic system. That is to say, the training of sila, or for want of a better word, morality, then the training of the heart and the training of understanding is supportive or is standing behind it. So it's in that particular area of life, the sila education takes precedence, or is in the limelight, but is backed by and supported by the samadhi and the panya elements. In the training of the heart, the sila and the panya trainings are supportive. They're standing behind it, they're informing it, they're enriching it. Similarly with the panya, or the wisdom, the development, understanding, then the sila and the samadhi are also present. To illustrate this, I would like to expand upon the training of sila. Sila, or morality, in Buddhism is not conceived of a number of commandments. The word, the Pali formula, which some of you may have chanted yourself or have heard chanted in the precept-taking ceremonies, Anatipata Verakmani Sikkhapadang Samadhiyami. First precept to refrain from taking life, from harming and hurting others. The last two words, Sikkhapadang, so it's a pada, means a subject of, or an area of education. Samadhiyami means to undertake. So translation is that there is, I voluntarily undertake the education of my conduct with regard to other living beings. I undertake the education, the training to refrain from hurting and harming. So there's no reward and punishment, there's no carrot and stick here. It's important, it can only be sila if this training is undertaken voluntarily. So if you refrain from hurting others, killing others, well, wonderful, that's an admirable thing to do. But if you're only refraining from hurting others because you're afraid of the reaction of those around you, or perhaps of being punished or going to prison, or even going to hell after you die, then it's not sila. That's not Buddhist morality, because it lacks this essential feature of commitment, voluntary commitment. So the wisdom element here is that you have to see the suffering for oneself and for others inherent in harming others, and the value and the nobility and the duty of refraining from harming and hurting. And similarly with the other precepts. Now, not only do these precepts have to be taken on voluntarily, but they also have one's attitude towards them has to be protected from gaining ideas or any sense of self-aggrandizement, or perhaps a desire or hope that by leading a moral life, then after death go to a heaven realm. You know, that's not to say that keeping the precepts will not lead to rebirth in the heaven realm, but that the desire for that result tarnishes keeping of the precepts. There's also a very memorable discourse in which the Buddha said, if you keep precepts purely, and on the basis of your moral purity, you consider yourself superior to someone who doesn't keep most moral precepts, your sila is thereby impure. So being proud of purity is impurity. So it's not, so I don't want to do this because I'm afraid of punishment, or it's not what Buddhist morality is at all. It's a training. And the keeping of precepts requires a number of virtues that need to be cultivated on a regular and consistent basis. The most obvious, I think, is that of mindfulness. And I don't think that it can be stressed or emphasized enough that you can't just be aware. Just be aware. You can't. It's not possible. You have to be aware of something. You have to be mindful of something. And the degree to which you clarify your object of mindfulness, or the skill with which you make use of what I would call pegs for mindfulness, are the guarantee of success, both on the moral plane and in the more subtle, internal levels, planes of the practice. So how do you, in this busy, overwhelming world, sensual overload world, where there's something crying out, calling out, pleading for your attention all the time, and where the external features of your world which are encouraging you to live well and wisely and kindly are far exceeded by those things that are encouraging you in every possible way to live unwisely and heedlessly. How do you establish that sense of awakeness, awareness, presence of mind, clarity of mind, good judgment? And initially, the recollection of precepts is the most valuable tool. So in any kind of social situation, making a clear determination that whatever happens, I won't lie, I won't cheat, I won't exaggerate, I won't conceal, I won't speak harshly, I won't speak divisively, I won't try to set people against each other. I won't gossip about things which drain people of their goodness and energy and stimulate all that's dark and mean in their minds. And so by making a firm determination in that way, it's not that the determination in itself is effective, but it establishes a standard, it establishes an aspiration and a channel for your mind, and if it's right there in the forefront of your mind, then in daily life you're constantly recollecting it. You're coming back to yourself. You're coming back to the present moment again and again in a very effective way through mindfulness of precepts. So it's not that Buddhist morality is the precursor to meditation, but it is in itself a form of spiritual development. And we learn so many things by keeping precepts. I think it's sobering, quite frightening actually, when we start to be very honest about how honest we are in our speech, how often we like to think ourselves as basically honest person, don't we? But then the number of times we compromise on the truth of our statements because we're embarrassed, because we want people to look at us well, we don't want people to look down on us or to lose their respect for us. We want something from somebody, I'm afraid if we tell the truth we won't get that thing that we want, whether it's a material thing or some kind of mental reinforcement. The effort to be completely truthful is a very intense purifying practice. And we notice that the kind of frustration that lay Buddhists know, oh, I don't have time to meditate, there's just so much going on in my life. That's really beside the point. Now, on this topic, I would like to suggest that a good framework for understanding this Buddhist education is one expressed, understood in terms of the framework of what we call the four right efforts. So that's one factor of the Eightfold Noble Path. In the threefold abbreviation, it's considered to lie within the category of the training of the heart. And there are four elements. The first is the effort to protect the mind from unwholesome, negative, toxic mental states. So that needs a vigilance, a heedfulness, a clarity, a precision of mind in every situation. But it's almost impossible that we're going to be completely successful with that effort. So we also have to be ready and to be committed to strategies of reducing and eliminating these negative, toxic mental states that have already arisen. Then we also put effort into cultivating, creating all those positive, noble, uplifting mental states that have not yet arisen in our hearts. And lastly, to cherish, to care for, and to further develop all those positive mental states which have already arisen. Now I would suggest that if you look at your life, whether it's a very busy life or an extremely busy life, that it is still possible, whatever your circumstances, wherever you are, wherever you're with, to put one of those four kinds of effort into place where at any time, at every time. So you're going into a meeting, and there's perhaps one particular person going to be there, a board member or a colleague or a friend or an acquaintance, and is someone who you find really obnoxious, a really irritating person. And the natural kind of feeling that arises, oh no, today I've got to go into a meeting, I've got to sit through so-and-so and put up with the things he or she says and does, and you just feel drained and depressed and fed up before you even get into the room. But with this attitude, you say, okay, what's my practice today? What usually happens in this kind of situation? Well, I get irritated by this irritating person. That's what happens. And so you say, well, my intention today, my spiritual practice today, is to protect my mind and not allow myself to be irritated by this irritating person. Because it's not fixed and inevitable. Now, in the physical sphere, if a totally immoral or amoral monster was to put a human being, I'm speaking figuratively here, was to put his hand into a fire, his hand would burn. If any of you were to put your hand into the fire, it would burn. If a fully enlightened Buddhist master was to put his hand in fire, it would burn. Because this is the nature of fire, the nature of human skin is like this. And so we could say that whenever this human hand comes into contact with the flame, it will burn. But we can't say that whenever the human mind comes into the presence of, or into an irritating person, it becomes irritated. It's not fixed, is it? We can see this simple matter of observation, that the degree to which we become irritated or angry or jealous or anxious or whatever is not fixed. It's not the same level of intensity every time. There are so many other factors which come into play. We might, one day we might be in a really good mood for some reason, and the person perhaps seems a little bit comical, or we just don't worry about it too much because we're in such a good mood. On another day, we might be in a really bad mood or feel really insecure. Someone's just criticized us unfairly or demeaned us in some way, and so we're already very sensitive, and this time this person's words are especially irritating. And then we notice that just as our own response varies through the influence of various causes and conditions, then different people have different reactions. And that some people can be in the presence of this but not be irritated by them at all, may find them quite kind of lovable, eccentric. Here he goes again, isn't he cute when he starts behaving like that. So a lot of Buddhist practice in this way is observation, learning to observe what's going on and what's going on in your heart, and to see that there's no fixed connection between an external trigger and an internal mental state. These things are conditions, they're not the cause. The cause of any human suffering always lies with ignorance of the way things are and its attendant craving to get, to have, to become, craving to get rid of. So we can see this in our daily lives and say, you look sad, what's wrong? Oh, today so-and-so has just made me so upset, or I'm so hurt by what somebody said. Somebody abused me, or today I met someone who showed racial prejudice towards me, or so on. And so this is why I feel this way. But in actual fact, that's not the case. That was a condition. It was something which invited anger, invited hurt, invited fear, invited anxiety. But there has to be, you have to receive the invitation. There has to be something coming from you together with the external trigger. So this is not a teaching saying it's all inside and you just make your heart peaceful and calm and wise and everything will be all right. No, it's recognizing the influence of external conditions and being able to let go of any negative reaction doesn't mean that it doesn't that that's all right. If somebody is to treat you badly just because you have a black skin or a yellow skin or a white skin or a pink skin, your first job is not to suffer because of that. But secondly, next thing is you need to report that person or you need to do something about it. So equanimity is not the goal, but it's the path. Wise action, which leads to this sustainable happiness and welfare for self and others, always grows from equanimity. And we don't have this idea of righteous indignation, or you have to hold on to your anger, otherwise you just don't want to do anything. I think that's a mistaken idea and leads to a lot of unnecessary confusion and suffering. But the mind which is equanimous and bright and clear and alert is the mind that has a very clear and unbiased discrimination of what should be done right now, what needs to be left for a while, what should be spoken, what should be left unspoken, what should be said and done, not said and done. The mind which is free from anger and prejudice of any kind is the mind which is ready to act in the best possible fashion. The angry mind is a coarse, one-sided mind which buys into this whole idea of us and them, the aggressive and the right and the wrong, the good and the bad, and so on, and just tends to make things worse. What the value of it is just for a while you sort of feel good at letting off steam. That's about the extent of it. So, going back to this example now, these four right efforts, are based upon this idea that there is nothing fixed. There is no mental state which is part of or expresses who you are. And one way I like to talk about the mind and the body is to say that in Buddhist understanding there are no nouns, there are only verbs. Everything's a verb. Even the mind is, seeing the mind as a verb rather than a noun. There are things that are rising, passing away according to causes and conditions. And so, for that reason, we have to be constantly awakening and brightening the mind and clarifying the mind and strengthening the mind, because even though right now there may not be coarse negative mental states, we can't guarantee the future. Only the stream enterer, one who's realized the first level enlightenment, who can guarantee their mind is going to be free of negative mental states independent of circumstance. And any student of history will have observed how once the rules are suspended and a lot of the things that would earn you life imprisonment or a long period of incarceration in peacetime can earn you medals in wartime. When the external supports for wise and kind living are removed, many people who in peacetime would have lived a completely normal and conventionally moral life become awful, nasty people. And when things change, then unless we have this inner discipline and inner training, we just get swept away by that. And one of my best friends married my sister, and we used to play soccer together and close together. And he was, as a school, he was always greatly inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. So after I left home and I didn't see him for a number of years, so after I'd been in Thailand for some 6 years, I returned to England for a visit. By this time, my sister and the husband had 2 children. And we were sitting around and I said, are you still inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and Ahimsa and the non-violence movement as much as you used to be? And he said, oh yes, absolutely, but if anybody came near my kids, I'd kill them. So, this is it, we always have these exceptions, and there are certain circumstances where, we're not really sure. And, in a time of famine, in a time of civil war, so, when you felt unsafe, your loved ones were unsafe, everything can change. So, but although that kind of extreme situation may not hope that does not appear in your lives, the point I'm trying to make is that this effort, this inner discipline, and this skill, understanding the way of the mind and developing techniques and methods to protect the mind from the arising of mental, toxic mental states, is fundamental to this Buddhist training, and the effort and the techniques in the discipline of learning how to eradicate those that have arisen. This is what it's all about. A very simple, straightforward example. One of the antidotes for anger and aggression is loving kindness. And people can get a little bit sort of discouraged with this. It's all right to have show loving kindness for all sentient beings, all the universe. I love everybody, except for him. And it's usually someone in the same house. That's the problem. Or you meet somebody and he said, yeah, I know you're supposed to have metta and loving kindness, but this guy is just so obnoxious. I just can't do it. The very thought of wishing him happiness, it's just like, he's already got all this stuff, and I give him happiness as well. It's just not fair. But the point about metta, or loving kindness, is that we wish people well. So be specific about it. So if someone is really selfish and self-centered, egotistical, then what can you wish them? You can wish them, may they be free of selfishness. May they know the happiness of putting other people first. May they transcend this narrow, miserable attitude that they carry around with them all day. So you've changed them. It's not that you're sort of living in this sort of delusion, or love everyone, because you don't, and you know it. And that's all right. I mean, it's completely all right. But what you can do is say, I'm not going to dwell in aversion for this person because it's hurting me more than it's hurting them. And by just changing, yes, may they be free of that habit, of that kind of personality. May they know the happiness of freedom from that. And I think that's something that's very practical and applicable in any. So you have to start off, with what really works, rather than what you think should, a Buddhist or a meditator should be. Don't get into that. I should be. I should. Buddhists get ill. I should be able to deal with this better than I can, or they get sort of fearful and anxious, and I shouldn't be like this. I should be peaceful and calm. Or oh, it hurts. I'd like pain medication, but that would be sort of letting the side down because meditators have to be tough and deal with pain. So this isn't some kind of macho show for other people. You don't have to be anything very special. You just be honest with yourself and learn from experience. And so, like in daily life, I was saying the other day, walking through an airport or on a busy road, just do this loving kindness meditation, but very, very specific. You see someone who looks really kind of tense, and may they be free from stress and tension. You see someone who's very overweight, you say, may they be free of any suffering because of their weight. And try to think up something kind and specific for people that pass by. And rather than feeling stressed out, you can really feel very, very good, peaceful. So taking one step at a time, and so just as constant making this effort, we're not safe from negative mental states, it's easier for the mind to go downstream than it is to go upstream. But also, there is no beautiful, noble mental state which cannot be cultivated within your heart. This is the teaching of the Buddha. You know, sometimes we put up spiritual teachers on a pedestal. They're so wonderful and peaceful and holy and wise. But these teachers are just vessels. You know, when you say, "Oh, I have so much devotion," say, or inspiration with, let's say, the Dalai Lama, for instance. I say, but what is it really? You know, what's really going on there? What we're really inspired with are the compassion, kindness, forgiveness, integrity, and so on that we see within him. He's someone who embodies these qualities, makes them real to us, and inspires it. We're inspired by those qualities that we see within him, rather than the Dalai Lama himself. And the same with any teacher. And there's not one single virtuous quality embodied by the Dalai Lama or by any great teacher which cannot appear and grow and thrive within any one of us, man or woman, young or old. And so we have this effort to cultivate the good and the kind and to cultivate patience and kindness and compassion, mindfulness and inner peace. It's difficult, very difficult, but it's worth it. I don't know any great monk or nun, any great teacher who would look back on a lifetime of effort and say, "Oh, what a waste of time. I wish it wasn't, what a disappointment." Far from it. I think there's very few people who don't experience that sometime in their career, but spiritual teachers don't. So, every single breath, every single drop of sweat was worth it, because you can see how it truly leads to one's own welfare and happiness, and also the ability to create and stimulate happiness and welfare in others on a sustainable basis. So these beautiful qualities are risen, and we can't take them for granted, because if we don't look after them, they can disappear. And there's so many monks, nuns, meditators put a lot of effort, received some fruit from their practice, rested on their laurels, and now I've got it sorted out, I'm beyond this, I've transcended that, everything's wonderful, and they just little by little, drop by drop, disappears, and they wake up one day and say, "How did I get here? Where did that all disappear to?" And it's very common in spiritual life. Overestimation of one's attainment, and lack of interest and commitment to caring for and furthering one's spiritual attainments. These are perpetual themes in Buddhist history, and I'm sure in the history of any spiritual tradition. The Buddha himself asked about his practice directly prior to his enlightenment. Said there were two qualities which he felt were most instrumental in his enlightenment. One was unremitting, steady practice in all postures. And secondly, perhaps surprisingly, discontent with the attainments, his realizations that he was already enjoying. So the Buddha, without a teacher, without a framework, an external framework, without anyone encouraging him, still had within him this pushing onwards and onwards and onwards, never taking anything for granted. So these are some of the reflections that I would like to share with you today, and the ability to be mindful, to be aware and to be awake, to be wise in daily life is greatly supported, enhanced by daily meditation practice, but also putting forth effort in every posture and every situation. And when we do have time to meditate, then meditate. And you don't have to do it for, it's not a big thing. Just before, during meditation, I was saying, look at it as enjoyment. So, you say, I'm going to go and meditate for half an hour, I'm going to concentrate on it. It's like kind of a bit of a burden, you're already sort of shy or shan't have to do something else. Maybe I'll just go and lie down or go and send a message to somebody. But if you just change, this very sort of change to say, look on meditation as enjoying your breath. You say, I'm just going to go into my room for 10 minutes and just enjoy my breath for a few minutes. It's quite a good feeling, isn't it? Where's so-and-so? He's just enjoying his breath for a few minutes. So turn off your communication devices. Have times of the day when you're incommunicado. I think this is a word which we need to bring up and revive, uphold. Incommunicado. I think that would be a really good sort of Latin phrase on there. Sort of put up on, carved into the stone here somewhere. So having times when no one can get in touch with you and you're just in touch with yourself. And in meditation, what are you doing? You're putting forth these 4 efforts. It's not anything that you're enjoying, but in order to enjoy the breath, you have to be skillful in preventing hindrances from taking over your mind. You have to know how to deal with hindrances that have arisen, consciously bringing up what we call the enlightenment factors of meditation, or the jhana factors, all these technical terms, basically bringing up all that's wholesome and beautiful. And when those things are starting to arise, taking care of them, taking them further and further. So daily life and meditation, this is just different sides of the same coin. It's just one thing. It's a seamless practice leading from darkness to light and from bondage to liberation. So thank you for your attention.